I hear your ragged breath and smell the stench of your fear. I have vanquished death. I built Deseto. I know what it is to wait. Cthulhu helps me. My servants will lay you upon the sacrificial stone. My roar will rend the night. You will be mine!
Resident Evil is one of my favorite games of all time. With its limited ammunition, limited health, creepy mansion scenario and focus on puzzle solving, it is often cited as the father of the survival horror genre. As Doom did for the FPS genre, so did Resident Evil have a great influence on countless games following its release. As so often in gaming, inspiration always comes from older games, and this is the same with Resident Evil. First published in 1992 for MS-DOS, Alone in the Dark, developed by French developer and publisher Infogrames, is often called the grandfather of survival horror games, and could certainly be considered the Wolfenstein 3D to the survival horror genre's Doom. It already included most of the features which were built upon and incorporated into Resident Evil later. From a creepy old mansion, fixed camera angles, a haunting zombie population, to the possibility to choose between two different characters. It is all there. Even less obvious things like the old clock with a secret can be identified as clear inspirations to games such as Resident Evil. It is of course not a secret that Shinji Mikami, director of the first Resident Evil, certainly was inspired by Alone in the Dark, but unlike Resident Evil, the original Alone in the Dark trilogy does not enjoy the fame anymore as its more popular descendants. In the light of this, let's take a look at the grandfather of all survival horror games, Alone in the Dark. The story begins somewhere in Louisiana in the mid-1920s with Emily Hartwood, niece of artist Jeremy Hartwood, receiving a letter about his apparent suicide by hanging. She suspects that her uncle's mansion, named after the Syrian goddess Deseto, might have something to do with his death, and makes her way to the mansion to inspect the attic for any clues that may explain the early death of Jeremy.
I remember his voice saying, "Look at the piano, Emily. Look harder. Maybe the secret drawer will yield up an explanation."
Shortly after, we see the distressed Emily marching towards a creepy-looking old house. A monstrous figure lurking at the window, secretly watching her approach. As the doors slam behind her, Emily doesn't know yet that she's trapped and may never leave again. And after a stroll through the mansion, Emily starts her mysterious adventure up in the mansion's attic. First, she searches the room for any clues, grabbing a lantern, an old Native American blanket, and finds a note from Uncle Jeremy behind the piano. In it, he warns of hellish forces he has released, and that the suicide was to prevent his soul from being taken.
"They will find my body, but will not have my soul!" I can imagine the master's fury and the terror in the hearts of his slaves. I hear their footsteps. Some may understand what I have done. May God forgive me. Farewell, Jeremy Hartwood.
Emily decides to go downstairs and explore the second floor for any clues. The house is filled with strange portraits and exquisite furniture, but also with dangers lurking in almost every room. Searching the other rooms, on each side of the corridor she finds, among other things, an old Native American bow, an old saber and two small mirrors. On the way to the next staircase, she finds two indestructible monsters blocking the path. But, remembering a story she read about the Medusa, she cleverly uses the two small mirrors to defeat the purple, scorpion-like enemies. As she descends down to the first floor, the doors to the library smash into her face and the sinister laughter can be heard. Who or what was that? I won't spoil much more of the story, since it is a central part of the experience, and without multiple endings, it is basically a one-time deal, given the player has the patience to read all the documents and pamphlets in the mansion. I will just say it involves pirates, curses, ghosts, and just like in Resident Evil, there is a more sinister underground level, which contains the true nature of the house's dark history. As mentioned before, like Resident Evil, this game has two characters, but unlike Resident Evil, the story and abilities are the same, meaning it's just an aesthetic choice and not a choice of story.
I could not move.
While I truly adore the game, I have to admit the controls can be quite counterintuitive and annoying at times, and maybe the greatest hurdle for anyone who wants to get into the game. Like any good survival horror game, Alone in the Dark uses the tank control scheme, meaning you push up on the arrow keys to go forward, back to go backwards, and left or right to turn. Running is the first difficult skill you need to be familiar with. It is usually not required to run, but there are sections in which running is the only way to progress any further without dying. There is no designated running button, but instead you need to tap the up arrow key in a certain rhythm twice in a row and hold it down. This can be awkward at first and honestly doesn't really get any better. It still happens to me from time to time that I have to try multiple times before my character starts running. For any other action besides walking and running, you need to go to the menu by pressing enter and choosing which action you want to perform, and press enter again. Then you have to hold the spacebar button to actually perform said action. In the beginning you have the options to fight, open/search, close and push, meaning you choose for example open, go to the object you want to open, hold the spacebar to do so. If items are right in front of you, the pickup window is activated automatically. For all other items you need to use the open/search feature. Later in the game you will also be able to jump, though it is a horrible idea in a game like this. I recommend to save after every single safe landing, or you're gonna be biting into your keyboard at some point. Interactions of items are also done along the same line. You get options such as use, throw or put. For example, if you want to use a key to open a door, you do not only need to select the key and press enter for use, but you also need to hold down the space bar in order to actually use the key on the door. After playing hours of Resident Evil or similar games, it can happen quite often that you stand in front of a door, select use and wonder why the door won't open. You know how I knew when Resident Evil 0 was released in 2002 that the item mechanics are gonna be a pain in the butt? Because in Alone in the Dark you were already able to put items on the floor, which can become quite the hassle. It is however essential in this game, not because of limited space, but because of limited weight. In Alone in the Dark, your player has a limited amount of weight he or she can carry, so even if you drop 3 very light items, you might as well not be able to carry one very heavy statue. One annoying thing is that once an item is on the floor, every time you run against it, the pickup menu gets activated. So when you are as super smart as me, and know what items you need and which you don't, but put the junk items all into a narrow corridor, you're gonna have a bad time. Fighting makes use of the arrow keys while holding the spacebar. You have different attacks depending on which direction button you press. Down and up perform the slowest but strongest kick. Left and right are both punches. However, the left one is the faster but weaker attack, and the right hook is stronger but slower. When I played through the game again for this video, it took me some time to get the hang of it. But with a bit of training, you're gonna be kicking monsters' butts left and right without too much of a problem. And the same controls counts for the handheld weapons such as the easily broken pirate saber and the sword. The rifle and the revolver on the other hand are aimed with the left and right arrows, and pressing forward fires the weapon. All this while holding the spacebar to ready the weapon. Those two weapons are especially powerful to have during later portions of the game and should only be used in difficult situations in which no other option is available. And to be quite frank, I almost always prefer hand-to-hand combat over the shooting weapons, except maybe with that weird spider dog monster in the tunnels. All in all, I'd say the controls are super clunky, and for Alone in the Dark newbies, it will take a while until they even start to feel a bit comfortable. The enemy variation in this game is actually quite huge. Random ghosts sitting in a chair, zombies and chicken monsters, an entity called the Vagabond floating in the library, weird Japanese kappa-like monsters, and a giant worm blocking a whole tunnel entrance. The developers really tried to come up with as many weird things as they could. Not all monsters are great though, or make sense for that matter. Such as the squid thing in one of the mansion's bathrooms, which never really seemed too appealing to me. And since everything is basically made up of a polygon, sometimes it's too hard to tell what it is you are actually looking at. And the ghosts in this game, they are also particularly weird. They totally freak out when you get close to them and become a mighty death-bringing bubble that instantly kills you. One great feature of the game is that you have more options than to fight or flee from many of the enemies. For example, you can avoid enemies by closing doors, which sometimes messes with their pathfinding routines, I guess, and leads to weird scenarios like this little guy walking against the door all day. And sometimes you can even accidentally kill an enemy. I'm not sure if this was intended, but when I wanted to record the zombie coming up in the attic at the beginning of the game, he just waddled against the chest and died instantly. I think it's because I moved the chest a little, but I'm not quite sure. With a lot of enemies and tons of traps that kill you instantly, Alone in the Dark is quite a difficult and unforgiving game for new beginners who are unfamiliar with the genre. So, save often and save frequently. Once you know all the traps, it's a breeze, but until then, you have to be prepared to die from seemingly random things, such as falling through the floor, or even reading a book can kill you.
Na stellarum nigrarum et.
But since you can save anytime, anywhere, and there are no penalties for the amount of saves you have, you should use multiple save slots as well. Another tip for survival is that if you find any health items in the game, you should consume them immediately, regardless of how much health you currently have. Alone in the Dark's health system has no upper limit, so any health points you get just add up to the total number, which means you can increase your health points far beyond the initial 20 HP.
He who knows says nothing.
You get a lot of hints in the game through documents and monologues, such as the one given through Emily's dialogue at the very beginning of the game, advising you to push the old wardrobe in front of the window. Cause if you don't do it, a chicken demon will crash through the window and attack you. All of the documents you find are actually fully voiced, and the voiceovers are amazing and super weird at the same time. You get to hear all kinds of accents and strange dramatic performances. The campiness of it makes the game even more enjoyable to play. Kind of like you are controlling an old low-budget horror movie. If you thought Resident Evil's dialogues were weird, well, at least the voice actors didn't have to perform their lines in all kinds of different accents.
After the criminal selling off of Florida by the foul usurper, my father elected to remain in this inhospitable land, where we...
Holy Christ! Cried Captain Cortez, astonished by the strange rite we beheld.
It was during a conversation with G
She is my creation!
that one first heard of the New England fishing village of I
am immobilized. Damned Yankees!
But the documents are pretty much essential in putting together the story for the game, and they actually add quite a lot of flavor to the game, in that it is not always directly stated what happened, but more hinted at by histories told about the estate by random authors of the past. Oh, and one last thing. Since books are only dead weight, you better throw them away after you are done reading them. For me, this game contains two types of puzzles, or let's call them challenges. The first is using the right item at the right time to get ahead in the game, and the other one would be the use of certain items to avoid or kill certain monsters. These two concepts are not mutually exclusive, since there are actually occasions in which an unkillable monster blocks the path ahead. One of my favorite but optional of these puzzles centers around a pot of stew you find in the mansion's kitchen. When you want to consume it, your character will refuse and actually point out that it is in fact a stew made of human flesh. Tasty. A couple of rooms later you run into a zombie dinner party. Usually you would need to fight all of these guys or try to run around them somehow. But if you put the pot on the table, the zombies will just sit down and await dinner time. Some items to solve puzzles are so essential that it's almost unfair for the game not to tell you this. For example, if the lantern runs out of fuel and you used up all the gasoline you can find, you will not be able to finish the game. Further, if you only picked up the matches to light the lantern and forget the lighter, you won't be able to light the lantern again when you need it during the later parts of the game. That makes it important for anyone playing the game to have multiple saves at all times. In this game, experimentation is key, and don't expect every solution to be obvious. I really love this game. The atmosphere is great, with music and random sounds making you suspicious even of areas already explored. It successfully blends PC gaming with the Cthulhu myths, because Alone in the Dark successfully delivers that sense of classic horror. It rewards the player with a somewhat different feeling than Resident Evil. While RE is more focused on viruses and scientific entities, Alone in the Dark scares players with the idea that there's a truth out there in the universe to be learned, which is expressed through words and books and brings forth horrible monsters and curses that can devour your soul. I gladly come back once a year or so and play through it. Though I personally think the second game in the series is even better, the first Alone in the Dark always reminds me why I'm so into horror and survival games. As a kid, we would sit at a friend's house at night, huddle around his old PC and try to beat Alone in the Dark. It was scary as hell back then, and it is super nostalgic to me today. The game is cheap and readily available through services such as Good Old Games, and thus I can only recommend to anyone who is not scared of the horrible controls to give it a shot. For its time, and for me, as a lifetime fan today, it always remains the earliest introduction to the survival horror genre, and an awesome one at that. Until next time.